Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Joel Clark to do another episode of talking about Ravenloft Realm of Terror, the black box set. We're doing chapters 4 through, 9, 8? I don't know exactly
I think it's through 8. So we stop off at 9 spells in Ravenloft. Everything before that,
Okay.
we're gonna
All
talk
right.
about this time. And oh man, there's some meaty stuff in
Yeah.
this one too. I really enjoyed reading some of this stuff. So
And to give this some context, I used to run Ravenloft pretty much all through the 90s. That was the setting I ran. I used mainly the black box set and the red box set. And I remember using Domains of Dread when that came out, but I was less enthused about that. So I still tended to lean on the black box set. And I ran it in the early 2000s as well using D20. I forget the name of the company, but like the White Wolf company that was, I think it was Sword and Sorcery, made a bunch of Ravenloft stuff. Which I didn't care for that, and I didn't care for the D20 system with Ravenloft. So I went back around 2008 or so running Ravenloft campaigns using the old material. But it's been a while since I've read the black box set. And so, and Joel has never read it, so we're going through and reading it now. And I just want to say, out of the gate, I think we started this a week and a half ago. So this first chapter, we're going to be a little fuzzy on this first chapter. I do apologize. The rest of the chapters, I read them all today again, and I think Joel, I don't know when you read them, but it seemed like you were more fresh on those chapters as well. So
yes, because I usually space the reading out once every 2 days or so. So yeah, this first set of chapters of Fear and Horror Checks I read a while ago at this point, but I remember them because I really thought they were cool, and I like that there's two different varieties that cover two very different things. So,
But I just wanted to be clear that this is like a reaction to the black box set. It's not a lesson to the listeners. So they should So don't take our word for it. Read it yourself because we might get details wrong. But anyways, this is the first chapter is chapter 4, which is Fear and Horror Checks. And I don't know, what was your reaction to this chapter? And actually, before we get into that, Ravenloft added rules for fear and horror. Later on, they would kind of crib from Cthulhu and add in insanity, like madness checks and stuff. But at this point, they're just doing fear and horror. And basically, fear is stuff that's like an immediate threat to you, like a vampire chasing you. And horror is stuff that's shocking or grotesque and repugnant or like startling revelations that shouldn't be. Do you know what I mean? So just things that kind of, turn your world upside down in some way. And
it's a little less Lovecraft and a little more Poe, if I had to characterize it.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely the case. It's definitely not a game that's Cthulhu is all kind of really delves into the madness stuff, and it isn't until much later in the Ravenloft line that they really get into that. Horror does cover madness, but it's just not. It's not like
it's a more operatic madness.
Yeah. I would agree with that. What was your reaction to the mechanics?
Well, I was fascinated with them because they're a lot more fleshed out than I expected of this early of a design of something like this. I don't know when this came out in relation to Call of Cthulhu. I think Call of Cthulhu was like the grand progenitor of RPG.
Cthulhu was out, I think, in like, I don't know about the date exactly, but it was definitely out by like 81 or something. And
yeah, it had been around for a while.
Yeah.
But
I don't know the history of its sanity mechanics, so I don't know how fleshed out.
First Ed.
I'm sure it was, but I don't know how fleshed out, because I know mainly whatever edition was prevalent in like 1989-90. That's the edition that I mainly used. So, and I know I picked up that edition again not too long ago, actually, but I just can't remember which one it was. But like Cthulhu has had like 7 editions, I think, and
it's had a lot. Yeah, Chaosium pumps them out.
Yeah, but
the point I'm trying to drive at here is that's kind of the grand progenitor of psychology and horror, or psychology and RPGs is that D100 chart of going insane, right? Like that's kind of the core of it. So, and really, aside from that, the only thing I can think of like that drives that pops into my head about like what would be psychology in an RPG is the morale checks that bad guys had to make, and only bad guys and followers had to make these in D&D, and those come from wargaming. So like that's more of a like morale and psychology, like they're linked, but this is the intimacy of this psychology and its lingering effects really struck me as exceptionally well developed. So much so that even decades later, in games like World of Darkness and the new World of Darkness that came out for a while there, like rules like these, you still see echoes of this exact same kind of design. They're just that well conceived. Um, it did strike me that they might be, and because I've played with psychological rules before, because I'm a big World of Darkness fan, and these struck me as something that you want as kind of a rarer spice. I think that, and the rules seem to recognize that too. There's a few little clever things, like with fear, like player characters were not used to having to deal with psychology in terms of fear in D&D.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing for hirelings, that's a thing for the goblins you're fighting, but you're a hero and you get to choose how your hero reacts. But this game takes the, in my estimation, bold and wise stance that in a fear game, disempowering your protagonist is what you want. You know, you want to have this thing where there's something outside of your character they don't necessarily have like a manly control over that's intruding on the decisions you can make. And you saw that in the reshaping of the characters chapter, but here you see it in a more passive way. Like reshaping characters is based on I have done an evil thing actively and therefore I'm being punished. This is about I have experienced something traumatic and I don't get full control over how I process that. And that's alarming and fascinating in a way I really like. It's simple because it's just isn't like just like a it's a fear check. It's a save basically.
It's a saving throw.
Versus paralyzation. Yeah, so it's not even a new mechanic. Save versus paralyzation. So, and I like that too because some characters are naturally therefore braver than others by dint of their career. That's neat. But beyond that, like some of the coding of when you roll is kind of specific. It's like here are some guidelines, and one of them is like the hit dice of the threat, the thing that would cause fear, are more than double the total hit dice of the entire party. Okay, not everyone plays old school D&D, but like when you do, more than double the hit dice of the party, that's like unbelievably overpowered. You are so screwed in that scenario.
Before there were challenge ratings and stuff, hit dice is how we estimated the difficulty of facing a foe. So you would say like, oh, this hit die creature, it's got too many hit dice to throw at a party this level if you were trying to balance an encounter, which again you weren't always trying to do back then, but like it was definitely, that was the tool for that.
That was the yardstick instead of challenge rating. And challenge rating isn't necessarily it's got a little more thought put into it, but it's not necessarily a better system. What I liked about
not having challenge ratings was when you did need to eyeball that, it forced you to look at hit dice, it forced you to look at damage output and things, things that mattered in concretely in terms of what can this monster do? Like, can this monster kill? And I think they get into that here. I think isn't there also the creature can kill somebody?
Yeah, the maximum damage the creature can inflict is enough to kill the hardiest character in the group in just one round. They make that clear where it's like, look, if it's Cthulhu and he's going to step on you and you die, that's frightening enough that you might freak out and lose control of your character.
Yeah, and also it doesn't, the players, obviously their characters don't know what a hit die is, but those two facts are things that the characters would need to be aware of in some way. Like they might not know it's got hit die, but they know it's twice as powerful as the party in some way, or they should have some awareness of it.
And again, it explicitly calls that out. A character may only guess that one of these conditions is true. The DM must decide whether a fear check is appropriate. So, like, if you encounter, what is a Strahd von Zarovich, and he's like in disguise, and you don't recognize him, that's not horrifying. That's not going to make you terrified. Yeah. But when he stands up to his full height, and you see that it's like this vampire lord, okay, you might douse your britches.
Yeah, and I do like these. Now, again, I know a lot of people are there's criticism of this kind of mechanic, and there's like definitely a debate over whether this is good. Personally, I find that anything that affects a player's control, affects their ability to move, and things like that for horror games actually really enhances the atmosphere and makes for a more scary session. So with fear checks, the thing that it does is, number one, you have a chance of dropping your weapon or whatever you're holding, which is significant because if you lose your weapon, that makes you more vulnerable. And then,
especially in a setting like this where sometimes your weapon is the only kind of thing that can hurt the monster you're dealing with. So it's a silver sword and you lose it, that werewolf is going to murder you.
Yeah. So fear checks are a tool that that do that. In the next step, I think you have to run away, if I recall, because you're fear
Well,
struck.
there's different ways you can react to it. There's like I think there's 6 different ways.
I think you're thinking of the horror checks.
Oh, I know. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
horror checks. Yeah, so
yeah.
fear modifiers. What do you do? Like it's.
So
Let's see.
so you see the fear check, and then it says like they have the chance of dropping the weapon, and then the next paragraph is whether or not you drop something. A character who fails a fear check is fear struck. The survival instinct takes over, and he has no choice but to run away. So then you have to go anywhere as long as you're not dealing with the threat. Let's see. After that, it continue to attack you from behind. So there's potentially you're getting attacked as you're running away. And if you can't flee, then you have to turn and confront the threat. And where this gets really interesting is, let's see this. I believe that there's a chance that you could continue, but I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I might be thinking of one of the horror effects as well. But basically, there's this loss of control, which I think is interesting. And I also think that you drop your weapon is interesting. Again, I think its primary purpose in the game was this idea that if you have a player who's like, I just attack Strahd, it's like, wait a second, your character wouldn't do that. Like, and I think this mechanic is weighty enough that it can reinforce that argument to the player very well. Do you know what I mean? So I think it works. I feel like some people have a negative reaction to having that kind of loss of control, but on the whole, I tend to like games that do that. So here it is.
Here's the thing. Oh, go ahead.
Let me see. Yeah, you're still fear struck for like 1d4 rounds, even after the threat is passed, I think.
Because you're dealing with the fact that you get your fight or flight reflex tripped. And here's the thing: if you're going into playing Ravenloft, you have to understand this isn't Greyhawk. Like you're going into a very different, tonally different game.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the difference between like playing Super Mario and playing Castlevania. In Super Mario, like there's no delay on any of your controls. You press jump, you fire flower, you shoot the fire. You can go super fast in that game, and like there are like pits you can fall into, but it's more a test of your reflexes as a player and less a test of like the psychology of Mario. But in Castlevania, even the first Castlevania, when you can jump no problem, but whenever you press the whip, like you wait a second.
Yeah.
Like you're pausing and assessing the situation.
Resident Evil did that too, where it was not an easy game to control the character, and the point of view changed a lot, like the angle of the shot changed a lot. And I remember distinctly that lack, like it wasn't like you had no control. It's just that it was more sluggish in terms of, it was clumsy. I'll put it that way. The controls felt deliberately clumsy, and it worked. It made the game more scary because you were reacting more like somebody who was horrified.
In a scary situation, yeah. And that's telegraphed because you're not in a scary situation as a person. You're just sitting there on your couch in comfort and joy playing a video game. Or in this case, playing a role-playing game. But your character is in a terrifying situation, facing something that is a real chance of just annihilating them casually. They have to deal with the psychological element. These are good rules for that.
Yeah, and I mean, and they might be a little heavy-handed, but I do think it works because I feel like in real life, even if you're facing something that's frightening or that takes courage to overcome, you don't react the way you want to. Do you know what I mean? Everybody wants to react a certain way. Nobody does. It takes a lot of experience to get to a point where you react in the way that you want to with things.
Oh yeah, and my second, or I think this is a second ed module. My second ed foo is not super great, but I'm pretty sure that the paladin was immune to most versions of fear. So like a character like that is actually explicitly like, look, no, I fight evil. That's who I am and what I am. Like it really helps distinguish a character like that, especially because, as we established last time, the bad guys know you're a paladin and they know where you are.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up for a second. I actually, in the as we were doing this, I have an old second edition player's handbook, and I was like, you know what? I'll go to drive-through and I'll order a new, fresh version. Unfortunately, they don't have the '89 edition. They have the revised edition, which I'm not as much a fan of. But I figure, we'll get a fresh copy and maybe do another session of Ravenloft at some point. But so let's move on to horror checks. What did you think of the horror checks?
I love the horror checks.
Yeah,
I like them, especially because they're not triggered by things that are necessarily like frightening in a sense of like it endangers you. Like it attacks you on a psychic level. You see something so unnerving and revolting and disturbing that like your mind starts breaking apart. And it traumatizes you, and like the way that happens is unpredictable, and it lasts a long time, and you have to like you can get re-traumatized.
It's more emotional. Cool. It's more emotional. Like I think the explanation they give is something like you might have to make a fear check against a werewolf, but you make a horror check when you find the ripped up remains of your friends from the werewolf, right? Like that's kind of the idea. There's another example in there about a woman bathing by a river and taking her head off after she takes off her clothes, which is kind of humorous but also really creepy, which I thought was kind of a good example because it kind of starts out with a scene that's almost playful and fun, and then it's like, whoa, she's taking her head off. This is not expected.
This went sideways on me.
Yeah,
it's like
which
a
is what
Evil Dead kind of image.
But that's kind of what horror is. Horror is things going sideways in a way, right? Like that's a good. So I always liked that example. But yeah, so and also this is one where I think you kind of mentioned it with fear before when you were a little bit, you got them crossed. But I think one of the reasons why maybe you like this is you roll to see what the effect of a horror check is as well. So it has different results, which is, I don't know, I think it's more, I always remembered horror checks being a lot more fun than fear checks was my memory.
I Run Away isn't really the most satisfying outcome, but I kind of like when I get to roll on a critical failure chart or something like that because there's a little more meat to it than I fail and run. Yeah. Like in this one, like you could become obsessed with it, or you could fly into a rage and start attacking without thinking it, or just stand there totally dumbstruck. And like there's all kinds of great things that can happen to you. I love that. I love that like you don't, because it goes along with the idea that you don't really know how you're going to act under pressure until it happens, and then it's like, oh, I guess that's who I am under pressure. I love that,
and the effects can linger and stuff too, which is great. I think where Ravenloft went a little bit south for me was when they tried to incorporate the insanity mechanics, because the horror check, even though it was doing it like you said in more operatic tones, it was already doing it, and so when you add insanity on top of horror, it suddenly becomes too much. Do you know what I mean?
It's and a lot of these are things that happen in the insanity chart in Call of Cthulhu anyway.
Yeah, that's go ahead.
They're all kind of driving at that same point, like you're saying. Like in an extreme of emotion, this is how the human mind breaks.
Yeah, I think my only criticism of the fear and horror checks as they presented them here would be that I don't think that they do say that you sometimes have to roll for fear and horror. And I always felt that something about that was ungainly in practice. It's been a while since I've done it, but I always remembered that bothering me. I always felt like it should be one or the other. Do you know what I mean? Just because fear struck is an actual possibility on a horror check anyways, and it just doesn't necessarily, it just seemed like the layering of those two mechanics could kind of be difficult to deal with.
Well, and mathematically, you are getting people to the point where they're way likely to fail, even if they're reasonably brave characters. Because if you just keep rolling that D20, every time you roll it, there's a wildly inflated chance of failure happening. Yeah. So, like, I don't like rolling to failure is what that's called. So I would say the worst one should trump in my estimation.
And also I'm looking at the text now. It actually is. It doesn't. You roll them both, but you only make the second roll if the first one succeeds. So I think it's you wouldn't actually be dealing with both effects, but it's still, I don't know. Which actually that is kind of elegant, but I still think you should just be one or the other. Would just be simpler. I like simplicity in my old age.
Yeah, well, that's so. I don't want, whenever I have to do something like that, it feels lumpy, like it sticks out, because most of the mechanics are pretty smooth.
Yeah, but I really liked the horror check. I thought that and again the results are aversion, revulsion, obsession. Senseless rage is my favorite. Mental shock and fear struck. I've always, like, whenever I've done mechanics like this, I always have some variation of senseless rage that I bring into it, just because that one always really worked for me in play. It was the one that, like, the idea of this guy just continuing to destroy whatever was horrifying him, even potentially harming friends and allies, was is one that I always liked.
Well, I like the option rule at the very end where you can get kind of inured to fear if you keep encountering the same thing over and over.
Yeah,
That's nifty.
yeah, you kind of get hardened from it, you know.
Well, and I like that because one of the things I love about role playing is how the characters change once they have to deal with the circumstances of the campaign. You know, because characters, especially in old D&D, were largely defined by like their reputation and like the stuff they had gotten from adventuring and the particular things they had done. And like this is kind of an extension of that, where like you feel different as a player in your character when you've started a campaign running away from monsters, and then like 30 sessions in, you're level 5 or 6, and you get to the same werewolf that's been horrifying you this whole campaign, and you like basically don't even have to roll. You're like, nope, I got a silvered sword, and you're toast.
Yep.
That's an amazing feeling, and it's impossible to replicate without taking that much time and having mechanics that reinforce it. And so I like that a lot.
And so let's go down to the next chapter, which is werewolves
Yeah.
and vampires. What did you? And then now we're getting into territory that we're. This is not last week's reading, but this is more today's reading, so it'll probably be more fresh.
Yes. Well, I only stumbled like once in that last one. I'm pretty proud of that.
I feel like I was a little bit behind in terms of what I remembered, but I think that the reaction was still. Yeah. I definitely didn't remember it as well as. I mean, I read it like a week and a half ago. So, what about this chapter though? What did you think about it?
I almost feel like it didn't go far enough because this is a chapter that is kind of reintroducing monsters that are in the monster manual and trying to make them fresh. Like that's kind of the function of this chapter. It's like, okay, lycanthropes are werewolves, yes, but also everything you know about a werewolf, you can kind of change it. You know, here's some different triggers for lycanthropy. Some of what it does is it kind of rationalizes the distinction between like being born a lycanthrope and being cursed with lycanthropy. I always thought that was a dumb distinction. Personally, I just isn't one were creature enough. But I'm also like I'm not a big fan of like were.
No, here's why that distinction exists. Here's why I think that distinction exists. You kind of want to do the howling sometimes. Do you know what I mean? And that's hard to do if that distinction isn't there. Do you know what I mean? Like that idea of. Well, I guess even in the howling, it's still not that same thing. But you know what I mean? Like there's a difference between movies where the werewolves are sort of part of a society of werewolves and movies where it's just somebody who is totally losing control and at the total mercy of the curse of lycanthropy. And having natural...
The opposite of the howling was American Werewolf in London.
Yeah, that's a perfect
Right? Those are the
example.
two poles.
Yes.
And this wants to do both.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm saying is it gives you the breadth to do both, is the advantage of having natural and infected lycanthropes in a setting. But
I suppose, but here's the thing. Having ran Werewolf the Forsaken, I didn't run the Apocalypse, but I ran the Forsaken. The Forsaken is the howling. That's just what it is. You're a bunch of werewolves and you werewolf it the hell up, right? I will say that's a fun game if everyone is a werewolf and if everyone has a thing to do as a werewolf. And in any other case, if you're mixed and only one person's a werewolf, it's just weird because they kind of play another different game.
No, I get what you're saying. Well, keep in mind, normally player characters wouldn't be expected to be natural lycanthropes. That's sure. I think the difference here. That's more about the villainous threat. Do you know what I mean? But I think I don't know. Here's what will be the test. When we get into the domains, you'll start seeing the role that natural lycanthropes might be playing in this setting, and then tell me if you think natural lycanthropes would be better, or just having infected ones would be better, or if having both would be best.
Here's the thing. I generally don't like it. I wanted to lead in with that because I feel like it's muddled. But in this, I think it might be necessary, and for the reasons you're pointing out. One of the other important things this chapter does in a subtle way, it doesn't come out and say it's doing this, but it does this very well. And we've mentioned it before. It takes something familiar, your werewolf, your vampire, whatever, and it says, here's ways to make this new. here are some other ways they maybe it's
Yeah.
a were warthog,
Yeah.
and it only changes at the sight of blood.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not silver that destroys it. Maybe it's a totally different thing. And like there's a lot of that in this chapter, and it's not only with that, because vampires have that same weird muddledness. They're even more muddled in this because again, you kind of have two sorts of vampires. You have the ones that are like vampire lords, and then you have like the toady vampires that kind of suck as vampires that are made
Yeah.
by vampire lords. But this one, it has other vampires. Like maybe you were cursed with vampirism, and so that's just your curse. You
Well,
know?
and like you said, this you felt that this chapter didn't go far enough, and I think that that's correct because they ended up doing a whole line of books based around this chapter. The Von Richten guidebooks are essentially an expansion on this concept.
Oh yeah, and
you
you could see where there need to be more options.
Yeah,
Like I
yeah.
want like D100 lists. There's little D10 lists in here.
This this chapter to me is the seed that made Ravenloft work as a setting. Like this is like once the Von Richten book started coming out, that's when I really started to understand how to run Ravenloft. And I think it sort of it begins in this chapter, but like you're saying, it doesn't quite go far enough because they have like what 5 pages to work with.
Yeah, there's not much in this
Yeah,
chapter, and it's an important role that it's playing in the
yeah,
overall way you would run this campaign.
yeah. But it is a tight space, and like both of us have worked in tight spaces writing wise,
Yeah.
and I think they do a good job with the space that they've allotted for it. But it
Oh yeah.
definitely is a chapter that needed to be twice as long at least in order to really get across what I think
Even
they wanted.
even just having two more pages that were just giant lists of options for
Yeah,
weaknesses and powers would have been maybe enough to have given you enough to actually go as far as these introduce. Like they
yeah.
don't these don't have the page count to really go as far with the concept that they introduce
But they
that they
probably
need
give you
to.
the idea at least, right? Like they give
The
you
idea is
the
good,
yeah,
and like I think that that's what I admire the most about these. They not only do they give you the idea, but they have these good, clever ways of structuring it. Like I like that they tie the vampire abilities to their age. The
yeah.
longer the vampire's been alive, the more powers they have. Vampire the Masquerade came out a year later and has that exact same thing.
Well,
It's
and I
based
think
on
that
your
was a trope.
generation, but
Yeah, I mean that was definitely a trope in literature and stuff. So it's like a you know, but it's nice that it actually has that like that that you can have ancient vampires being much more powerful than like a regular vampire, for example. Um, and they do something similar with werebeasts. Not quite as much. I feel right. Like the werebeasts get a little bit of that treatment, but it feels like they're you have to wait for
well,
the
the single most interesting thing to me about the werebeast is that there's only one way to remove the curse of lycanthropy from someone, and you get one chance, and if
yeah.
you fuck it up, then you have to kill them.
And
There's
it's
really no other
dramatic.
option.
It's they take
It
they
is.
take they take standard priest spells, and if you've ever seen movies with exorcisms or anything, you immediately know what the visual of performing these spells is going to be. Do you know what I mean? It just has like a there's something very Catholic I feel about
Oh yeah.
the depiction there. It really works for me. Um, the Yeah, I like this chapter, but I agree with you. It's lean, and it definitely could have used more. You probably could have also used more monsters in here than just vampires and werewolves.
Just vampires and
But
werewolves.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it
um,
would have been nice, and I think that later chapters actually do a little bit of that lifting for this chapter,
mm,
because like I picked ahead to the bestiary and like the different zombies and skeletons that are in here, like they turn the concept of those things from the monster manual on their ear and give you something fresh, and I like
yeah.
that.
At one point, we'll have to look at like the Guide to Lycanthropes or something, because that really gives you an idea of just how far you can take this concept. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, they have Strahd skeleton and Strahd zombie, lycanthrope, Lautgero, an Odin, which is some kind of ghost. They have Geist instead
Odin's.
of ghost. Yeah, all
Yeah,
kinds of
we'll get to that when we get to that because
all kinds
that
of
stuff.
nifty
Yeah,
nasties.
there are some good monsters in that section. Some of those monsters are good. A couple of them, I don't know. I was always a little bit on the fence with, but a lot of them are good. So the next chapter is curses. What did you think of this chapter?
Ooh, the curses. Okay, let me flip to it and refresh my memory real quick. Oh yeah, this is the one. This is the one where again they're they're trying to reconcile kind of two different takes on curse, right?
Yeah.
Because there's the I am a wizard and I use my curse spell to curse you. Then there's also the you have done a great evil and someone loathes you for it, and therefore the universe itself creates a curse out of their hate.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that is by far the richer concept, and the book knows that. And
Yeah,
therefore
I
it
mean
makes
that's the
that more
concept
interesting.
they're interested in for sure. They're
Mhm.
they're they're kind of poo-pooing the spellcaster curses a little bit.
Well, yeah, and they're explicit whenever they're talking about designing a curse. They're like, don't mention game mechanics. Uh, Make sure the curse is founded in something. Tailor it to their victim. Like they really want you to be creative with how curses manifest,
Yeah.
and they're really great because they categorize them in a way that's kind of intuitive to use. You know, because they have different strengths. The curses do. And I loved the strengths of the curse. I think that was maybe my single favorite part of it,
Yeah.
where the lowest level is embarrassing.
No, I like the curses. I think it's great, and I like that it's a mechanic, but there is no real mechanic. It's more like a
Mhm.
guideline. Do you know what I mean? It's just sort of like, no, you can develop a curse and sort of implement it, and it gives you, you know, it's a procedure with guidelines. That's how I would describe
Yeah,
it.
and
But
it's a procedure kind of in the same way that like hex crawling or dungeon crawling is a procedure, where it's
yeah,
not really explicitly referring to mechanics so much as it's kind of telling you like here's how you wrangle this kind of nebulous
yes,
thing.
yeah. This is how you take all of these elements of the setting coming together and you shape them into something that is fair. Do you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
workable. Um, I like the curses here. If I recall, I think they kind of got very elaborate as the line went on. I could be wrong,
Mhm.
but I seem to remember that happening. And I feel like this was like very easy. Like you can probably just tell by reading this. This is easy to implement. This is not
Oh yeah.
hard.
Well, and what I sincerely love about how good Curses is, this is my favorite one we've read in this thing, by the way. What I love about Curses as a chapter is this is not in any way limited to Ravenloft. You could
No,
use this in
no.
any game.
Yeah,
You
you
could use this
definitely could.
exact same set of guidelines in any game and introduce curses in the exact same way. And as a matter of fact, my one of my all-time favorite games, Legends of the Wulin, this is almost exactly how curses work in that
Mm.
too. Someone has a powerful passion and it screws up someone else's reality. And it's the same basic thing. And I gotta tell you, it was highly praised whenever Legends of the Wulin was new. I don't know how much people feel about it now, but like I am amazed they weren't aware that these, what is this, 3, 4 pages existed
They might have
because
been
they're
aware of
brilliant.
it. It's possible.
Uh,
Well,
They're
actually, I guess you would
brilliantly written.
know. You would probably know more than anybody. Um,
I
but
there in all the scuttlebutt around Legends of the Wulan, I never heard anybody mention Ravenloft.
okay.
So
I mean, it's a lot. Like I said, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel in gaming, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. If people reinvent the wheel, that means it's good technology. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean it's founded on the same principles. I
yeah,
mean like even calculus was invented by two people in the same
yeah,
generation.
yeah.
You know?
I think it's fine. Sometimes we obsess too much about what's the origin point and all that. I'm not as what I'm interested in is does the mechanic work, and in this case,
Yeah,
the
does it make
curse
a
mechanic.
good
Yeah,
game?
yeah, the mechanic works. I like the mechanic here. Um,
I love this. This is the kind of game design that I will give my hearty stamp of approval to. It is robust. It is robust because you can take it out of its source material and it still does the same thing. It's robust because it doesn't require a particular set of game mechanics to work. It's robust because it's a set of principles and processes that consistently work whenever you're doing a role-playing game, and they make this happen consistently. It's really fantastic game design.
Yeah, so I think it's a great chapter. I was surprised how smooth it was reading through it again
It
too. That was
is.
one of my. I was expecting a lot more. I don't know, a lot more ungainliness, and it wasn't really there. We'll get when we get to fortune telling, we might encounter some ungainliness, but I think the curses are really well sorted. Uh, okay, the next chapter is gypsies. Obviously, this is one I think this is probably one that the new Ravenloft has had a lot of the more trouble with because of
the, this is
the
what we
cha-
call a baggage chapter. That's got a lot of baggage, and I don't think a chapter like this would get written outside of like the '90s. You know,
yeah,
um,
probably
like
not, probably not.
explicitly the '90s too. Like not even an earlier generation. Because the 90s was a unique time when it came to race relations, especially in the United States, so this was written, because like the exoticism was seen as a universal positive with anyone who was like a non-white race, right? And there was no real knowledge in pop culture about the differences between ethnic groups or anything like that. But there was like this unbelievable like openness and positivity about people that were different than the norm. I mean, in
Yeah.
general, '90s was a big
Well, I
celebration of
think
different cultures anyway. But
my take on it has been, and again, I'm ancient. I'm out of the loop. So like, but like when this came out, we didn't know about real gypsies at all. We didn't know
yeah,
about Roma. Like to us, they were all we knew is what we saw in the movies. And because again, this is an American product, and Americans,
yes,
it's not like
this is
there's not there you don't encounter gypsies, you don't encounter Roma. They exist, I'm sure, but you just don't like. It's not like
yeah,
when I
but
went to Europe, I actually saw Roma. Do you know what I mean? But in America,
yeah,
you
and
don't.
this is
Um,
a very I read about this particular thing in a
yeah,
book kind of
yeah.
chapter. Like this isn't founded in someone's experience.
But what I will say is, I think what they were meant to embody is like gypsies at this point just embody this ability to live outside of the culture, to sort of be free, to to not abide by society's rules. And so even though some of the things are presented as stereotypes, I think they were, and again, it's, I know it wouldn't pass muster today, but I think at the time it was meant as more of a positive association than a negative one. Do you know what I mean? Where it's
Mhm.
sort of like they're this transgressive, sort of colorful, humorous, and carefree
Well, and
element of the setting.
they're talked about in universally positive tones. Like there's
Yeah.
no negative judgment anywhere in here about
The
them. They're described as
the closest that you can get to negative is when it says they're charlatans, but it's said in a way where it's really kind of like
well,
they're
it makes sort of
charlatans. They're
it blends that with the general human tendency to be charlatans, though. Like it doesn't say, "Oh, that's been a particular thing to them." It's like, well, some people are liars, and so there's a chunk of the population.
No, but
And
there
the
is a
reason
point where they
that's
say that they're. I do think that it sort of presents them as I don't know, it's sort of you know that's the element of the Vistani that is enabling them to exist outside of society. Do you know what I mean? I think that's the angle that they were taking there. I have to get back to the line though, because I can't really remember how it was phrased exactly, and I don't remember exactly where the. You keep talking, and I will
I
try to
get you.
find. I will try to find the charlatan reference to see which characterization is more accurate. Um,
Fair enough. And like that's the thing. Like I was saying, the way race relations worked, especially in the early '90s, it's very different than our modern concept. And it was optimistic and naive and ultimately dumb, I think, and then maybe a little bit more than a little bit offensive whenever you actually like, because a lot of this was like these are white authors talking about something that they have absolutely no real knowledge of. Like again, this is a I saw a gypsy fortune teller in a Hammer horror
yeah,
movie,
yeah,
and I wanted to be in this game because that felt
but there's
totally
no
appropriate
I
to
don't
me.
think there was any malice in it, and I don't
Right.
think and
It's not racist in the sense of coming from a place of hate and prejudice. It's more like naive. And it's coming from a place of optimism and ignorance, you know?
yeah, which
And like that's the distinction here.
yeah, and again, I mean, I'll tell you like right out, like I'm personally not offended by it, but I'm an American and I was grew up in the '90s, so I don't necessarily have the sensibilities of somebody now. But
Oh
it
yeah.
was,
And
but I have a friend, my friend Rob, who we've had on the program. He took issue with the Vistani, so like it's not a universal thing with people my age. There are people my age that have different points of view on this. Um, I had a pretty involved discussion with Rob where he didn't even like the way gypsies were portrayed in Dracula, for example. So again, I think the thing is though these are conversations that don't have to be as simple as they often are online, if that makes sense. And
yeah,
I think when
well,
you're talking about '90s stuff, the '90s is such a weird period,
it
and
really is a
yeah,
weird period.
there was, I mean, like number one, there was a lot of drugs. There was a lot
Mhm.
of there was a lot of rebelliousness, a lot of transgressiveness, and that was like the era of like Lollapalooza and stuff like that, and so
Lollapalooza.
yeah, you have to kind of. I mean, I'm not saying that you need to read this chapter and say, "Oh, this was the greatest thing," but I think that when you see a chapter like this, understanding that that was the context when this started, and again, this is early 90s. This is like 1990, I think, or 91.
Yeah,
so it's very early, but there was still a lot of that stuff in the air brewing. Do you know what I mean? So, it's just a different time. But yeah, so I don't know, what did you think of the Vistani? Like, that stuff aside, what did you think of the presentation of the Vistani for the setting?
There's a couple of things about them that I find redeeming. I like that, again, that they're talked about in positive tones. I like that they have a sense of realpolitik about them. They can cast curses, they can see the future, they have real magic powers that are tonally appropriate for the setting.
Yep.
I like that they just give the middle finger to the mist and just go wherever the hell they want. That makes them so intrepid and fascinating.
I mean, that's their big thing, is that they can travel more freely through the mists, and they seem to have. They're more free than other people in general, right? Like, that's just kind of.
Yeah, it's because their freedom is, and there's a certain like I don't know, almost dangerousness to their freedom. Like, it's not evil to be free, especially when you're talking to an American audience. Like, freedom is our favorite thing, but like the way in which they're free is strongly contrasted against like the sort of, because with a gothic atmosphere, like, it's all like castles and peasants in hovels and people huddled into churches terrified. These are people that stay where they're born their whole lives, and so when you contrast that with just how like vibrant and mobile and dynamic the Vistani are, like, that's a really significant contrast, and I think it's a really cool one.
Yeah, I think in terms of giving them a place in the setting, the chapter definitely works. It's a fairly lean chapter. They do have a guide to Vistani later on. I sort of had mixed feelings on that one, because I feel like the Vistani were never like a threat like a lot of the other monsters were in the guidebooks, so it wasn't necessary to have all this information that the GM now needs to memorize in order to run Vistani.
This is enough, to make a D&D culture, because it's not like we're talking about a real human culture here. They're based in one. These are definitely, like you said, they're based in Roma and Roman mythology.
Though I gotta say, a lot of this looked pretty Italian to me. That was sort of my
you mentioned that. Yeah. Like, I didn't see it, but I only have like one Italian.
I could be wrong. Like, and I don't know anything about Roma, so I don't know if this, if but there's stuff in here that like I definitely saw as like they have like the Maloik. Do you know what I mean? They have stuff like that, and
what was it, the Aniso that you were talking about too?
Yeah, like Anise is like liquors based on like anisette stuff based off like, I guess, like it's kind of got like a licorice type flavor. Do you know what I mean? Like, that was like one of the
that sounds good, actually.
Yeah. There's also cookies that are flavored from that. Just things like that. I don't know. That was just sort of my general kind of reaction. Was a lot of this seems kind of, obviously the stuff with the wagons and the violins. Well, violins too, but like the way the violin. Yeah, too. My grandfather played violin, actually. That was I don't know. I just again, I don't know enough about this about Roma to say one way or the other, but I just thought that there was kind of some Italian seeming things in here. But yeah, I don't know. Anything else on this chapter?
I mean, here's the thing. I understand why someone would take offense to this. Like, I get it. There's a lot of like negative stereotypes this is based off of, and you don't necessarily want to immortalize that in your game. But at the same time, that's a lot of hubbub over something that's only a few chapters long, and you can completely excise from the setting if you really don't like it. Like, you don't have to have gypsies in your Ravenloft. You don't. I honestly, I'd probably put them in.
I think they still have them, though. To be honest, I think they still kept them.
No, they do. Because remember, this got acquired by a huge corporation, and corporations, they never throw anything away. If it's their intellectual property, they leverage it. That's how it works. It is foolish to discard something that could make you money.
Also, so. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I think that I remember, because I was I don't play 5e, and I'm not that aware of a lot of the conversations, but I do follow Ravenloft discussions, and I think a lot of the complaints I saw about the presentation of the Vistani were more about stuff that they introduced in Curse of Strahd that was actually kind of worse than this chapter, if I remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there was stuff in there that like suggest. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't remember, but I just remember there being things in there that looked like more negative stereotypes than were present in this one.
So I will say of this chapter, as a White Wolf fan, infamously White Wolf had a supplement called Gypsies, and it was like every stereotype in the book. It was a really big chapter. They had like ethnicity based powers that were really based on some crummy stereotypes, and it went about like a lead balloon. There's a vampire clan called the Ravnos who are like clearly based on like the Romani, and they've got like the same set of stereotypes, and it's so it's not like gaming has always handled like looking at these few pages. This is so much less offensive.
There's not a lot here, right? So like no, but I will say one thing. I've never read the Vampire Guide to Gypsy, so I have no idea. Like I've heard people complain about it. So but I do want to defend the writer because her name was what, Tianan Woodruff, was that the name of her? She wrote some of the best Ravenloft material. She wrote the Guide to the Created, for example. That is one of the best books I've ever read for an RPG. I feel like I understand why people would be upset if there was content in there for whatever reason or whatever, but I feel like, I don't know, I think she was a great writer, and so I feel like, I don't want to just, attack that book without mentioning that she wrote the Guide to the Created.
And let's be clear about the distinction between criticizing something as it doesn't age well and criticizing something that was written by someone who actually has a terrible agenda. No one was racist who worked on this.
Yeah, I think
that's a ridiculous claim.
But that's kind of important because that's kind of like that's kind of getting this to where I think we should take it, which is because I've had discussions with people about Ravenloft in present day, and a lot of mostly younger gamers, but some older gamers too. I feel like the reading of the material is very uncharitable, where you could look at a certain lord and say, oh, well, that's sort of like you could make a female character that's less this way and more that way, and it would be better. But I think that like sometimes we look at these things as if they're all just benchmarks of do you know what I mean? Like it's sometimes a person is
you
just
have a set of standards. If it doesn't conform to those standards, it's evil.
Well, it's sort of like sometimes somebody's just trying to make something interesting, and they're not trying to bring any harm into the world. And they're not bringing any harm into the world, but you're carrying a lens that imposes that message onto what they're writing. Do you know what I'm saying? So I haven't read the Guide to Gypsies, so I can't comment on that one. But just based on the Guide to the Created and stuff like this, and just based on stuff I've seen
next time when we review White Wolf's Gypsies.
No, I guess what I'm just trying to say is I'm a little uncomfortable with the heat that's sort of that author has taken, because she was a good writer, and I doubt that there was any malicious intent there. Do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely not. But here's the thing that gets you under my skin about Gypsies from the White Wolf perspective. It's that they had a real content mill way of doing things, and that made them in every book cram in way more stuff into it that it needed to have to express the concept. And it was more about bilking whatever idea they had for the fattest book they could get. That is what made that book actually bad. And most of White Wolf books actually bad. There's only a few that are great. But the material they had to work with was not exactly abundant at the time it was being written. And so you actually inevitably, because of the facts of how they did business and what they had to work with, you had to make Gypsies like it turned out. There was no other way to write that book at that time.
Okay. I guess one comparison I could make is one of the reasons why I sort of fell out of love with at least the 3E Ravenloft, and why 5E Ravenloft doesn't quite look like it's going to be my cup of tea. It's just the way that White Wolf Wizards of the Coast, when they make books, they kind of have to fit in. Like there was a way that TSR made books, which I liked, And then there's a way that Wizards of the Coast makes book that I'm less in love with, which is it's sort of structured around the mechanics of the game more. So every book will have a, you know, I don't think they do it now for 5e, but like,
Well,
it would have prestige classes
edition.
and they would have feats and they would have all this stuff that has to be in there.
No, that's
And
exactly what they do now. That is
okay.
the White Wolf. That is the you got me doing it now. Wizards of the Coast business model is
Yeah.
here is the three core books for the game, and every supplement book has to have everything that's in those books in it, even if that doesn't make any sense.
And
Like even this book has some of that, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, here's how people would react to an elf in this setting.
Yes, yeah.
But elves were considered rarer in old D&D than they are now. They're like not even unusual to see elves now. Like it's pretty much common. They're just another kind of person.
But in their defense, the things they didn't do in this book was they didn't make new classes, they didn't make new races, they didn't make, you know, these, and those are all very player oriented things anyways. But in it, you know, the way that WotC tends to do things is you tend to get those things, right? You tend to get the new classes, the new feats, the new blah blah blah.
Well, that's the thing. They're expanding their audience because if only GMs bought this book, that means, you know, 1/5 of the people that play D&D are buying it. But if a player could buy this book and get new options, well, suddenly a lot more people could buy it.
I think that's true, but I've always felt that short side. I've never liked that model, and the reason why
It's
is
garbage.
Well, the reason why I think it's bad is the GM, and we're going way off topic, but the GM, it's really important that the GM be excited about running a game and that the GM have kind of their space that they're spoken to. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the WotC approach always kind of was focused on giving stuff to the players, and the players really became, it's, as a GM, here was my feeling going from edition to edition. Is I felt like I was GMing because I loved GMing when I was doing 2E. And when I was doing 3E, it felt like work. Do you know what I mean? That was kind of, you know what I mean? And my bosses were the players. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And so that's just, it's just a different vibe. Again, I think it probably does sell more books. I just don't think it's a great way to, I think when you're making a setting, the person you need to excite is the GM. The person who you want to make that information for is the GM. The players don't even necessarily. It's almost worse if they have access to it. You don't want them having access to that.
There's infamously, I like recruiting players who have never played an RPG before for my RPGs. Like I find my friends, and if I feel like they're going to be fun to hang out with in an RPG, I'm like, hey, look, make an elf, and we'll just play. My best gaming experiences are from players who barely know the rules and basically don't care about them because they're not thinking about the rules. They're thinking about being present in the situation in the game. They're thinking about role-playing their character. They're thinking about this. They're acting like a player, an ideal player for an RPG. And when you change that to someone who buys books, memorizes rules, demands certain things get included so they can have the exact kind of fantasy they want, that person should be a GM. That's not a player you're talking about anymore. They're further. I know people who play and only play that own more books for role-playing games than I do, and I write role-playing games for a living. Like, well, not for a living, but I do it and I make money off of it. So, like,
well, actually, that's a common thing. Like a lot of when before I started designing games, I played way more games because I didn't, I wasn't working on a line, so I wasn't like as focused on this one game that I'm making. Do you know what I mean? But like when you're making a game, you have to play that game, and you don't have as much time to pursue other types of games. But why don't we move on to telling the future? Because that's the last.
Yeah, that's the last chapter. Okay, and this was a fascinating chapter for me because, like, how do you do it? How do you tell the future in a role-playing game when the players actually have the freedom to change things? Yeah. And I think this actually starts off with that discussion.
It does.
Predicting the future in RPG, where they're like, well, you can't. And you shouldn't, because that would suck, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they give you a few approaches.
They give you some tricks, which I really like. Like the if-then. If this happens, then this will happen. Yeah. That's great. Because the players now are forearmed with a knowledge of, well, if we go to fight Strahd during, X on Volpurgisnacht or whatever, then we have to deal with the werewolf. Like the gypsy woman said so.
Well, the other sleight of hand they do, and this is kind of pulled from the original Ravenloft module. They basically take that mechanic of using the cards
Oh, and they generalize it. Yeah, that was
but
fucking
but
cool.
there's another sleight of hand going on there, which is it really isn't about telling the future so much as the present.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like they're just giving you information about things that exist that the enemy, like where is the lair of the bad guy? Do you know what I mean? Things like that. Like
Right,
that's not a future thing. That's like
well, that's
that.
just the present. But
Yeah,
here's the thing: it will happen in the player's future, and that's where it gets
yeah,
clever because it's like you give them information from the setting, but you phrase it in a way where you're predicting the future. So
yeah,
if you travel east upon the moonlight in the moors, you will find you then will come to the lair of the beast.
yeah,
Like, okay, that's a prediction.
yeah.
If you do that, then this will happen. But you could also just say that's how reading a map works. If we
Yes.
read the map and go where it tells us to go, then we'll get to where we're supposed to go if it's an accurate map.
What I like about this mechanic is they basically say get a deck of cards, and this is for the card reading. There are other types of things that they offer.
Yeah,
They
I
say,
like
get
the card reading
yeah,
though. That's a cool
yeah,
little thing.
yeah. They say get the cards, and then like pick like write out a bunch of different things that like the suits can mean, and then different things that different card values can mean, right? And then and then sort of explain like have like a key for yourself, and
Mhm.
and you can and these become things that get determined by the cards basically, which is which is I think again it's a gray area because on the one hand you're kind of leaving a prep decision to the cards, right? But it's the only way that you can really do
Well,
this
okay,
sort of
so
thing.
and here's the thing about that. I'm, as a GM, comfortable with not knowing what the name of the tavern is,
Mm-hmm.
or not knowing what the noble wants when they go in to get a job from him, and just rolling it off a chart. I'm fine with
Yeah.
it. Because whether I thought about it in detail, whether or not I rolled it out of the chart, functionally, it's going to do the same thing in the game. Does
Yeah.
it matter if there's an orc or an osher jelly or a vampire behind that door? No, it matters there's a monster behind it. So I roll, and whatever comes up, that's what's on the door when they open it up. That's
Well,
fine. You don't have to prep to the point where
no. I think where the here's where the issue comes in, and it's whether it's an issue really depends on the group. But where the issue can come in is the players will eventually realize that what's going on is these things are being determined by the cards. That the cards are not
I don't know if they
revealing it.
will. Because
Maybe
I've
not.
never had a player call me on rolling from a D100 chart. Because the roll happens on the
No,
other side of the screen.
but here you're actually showing them the cards and saying what's going to happen. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes, and like I mean, I certainly on some level I understand that that might be happening, but you don't have to do that. The other thing this tells you to do is just say like get information that they could just be given
yeah,
from
yeah.
just a person, make that associated with the cards. So they turn over the card and they happen to get that piece of info. From a player perspective, that's functionally indistinct from the card creating it. They
No,
wouldn't be able to know. How would they determine it?
that's true, but at the same time, if you do it that way, it's it might become clear to the party over time
I'd mix them
that
up, dude.
yeah, that might be a
Like
way to do it. That might be a way to
I
do
would
it.
I would put some true things that I've already established in there, and some things would just be association. I'd be like, I
Okay.
don't know what happens here.
Yeah.
So the players are going to be my D100 chart.
Yeah.
They're going to
And
pull up cards. I'm going to free associate. Then I'm going to make a note about it, and it's going to be a fact.
yeah,
And they
no,
will not be able to tell which one's which.
and I quite like this mechanic, but I just wanted to point that out because I feel like this is gonna what would be the way to say it? This is definitely gonna rub some style the wrong way, maybe. Do you know what I mean? Like
Well,
certain play styles might have an issue. Like if you, I feel like if people don't like things popping into existence randomly, the method where the cards determine where the layer is could
Mhm.
be an issue for them. Um, I don't have an issue with it because I feel like there's really no other way to do fortune telling. Like if you can't predict like what else would the players expect the GM to do except for like some kind of weird sleight of hand with cards or something, right? Like there's just the GM isn't going to be able to actually demonstrate fortune telling ability, so you have to
And
simulate
that's the
it.
thing. And there's the way that you would go about this usually is you would simply describe someone turning over cards,
Yeah.
in their wagon or whatever, or looking into a crystal ball. The genius of giving them the deck and having them flip over the cards and become like immersed in the actual physicality of that act, and then those things, like those things meaning something in terms of what will happen in the game's future, no matter which approach you use to legitimize that, whether you're just giving out information that was already there, whether or not you're freestyling it right there on the spot, whatever you're doing, even if you're just making if-then statements and they're not even connected to the cards in any way, the fact that they are immersed in that moment, like that is such a powerful spice for a suspension of disbelief, because it does actually matter within the context of the game, and they actually really did flip over those cards. That's real to them in a way that's very different than you just describing the scene, and I really love that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a nifty system, and also one thing I will say, I sometimes I praise the black box and I kind of denigrate later stuff, but the red box, I think it was the red box or the was it Forbidden Lore? One of the box sets had a bunch of stuff on Taroka, the Vistani cards, and like a dice rolling thing to simulate, I think, rolling the bones or runes. I can't remember what it was, but it was a lot of fun. It added a lot to the game.
It does too. Like having little props like that really matters, especially in an atmospheric kind of moody place like this.
And the Taroka deck, see the art of the Stephen Fabian art on the page. He did he did the whole deck. So you had a whole Taroka.
What a treat that must have been.
It was great. I wish I still had mine.
Yeah, Stephen Fabian makes this book come alive. He really does.
And they basically just had a deck that was like a setting appropriate tarot deck. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's all I would want out of it. I don't need much.
But yeah, I thought that this chapter was interesting. Again, it was just there were times where, I don't know. Like I think I noticed a few errors actually in the example, if I remember.
No joke. Where's that?
I think it doesn't line up. Well, maybe it wasn't meant to, but like some of the examples, I don't think lined up with the key that they created.
Oh, really?
I think so. I could be wrong.
I didn't read it in that level of detail because I was thinking about it more like a big picture thing. But yeah, it might not. Ooh.
I can totally see how that would happen though. So I mean, the point is still, is made either way.
Oh yeah, right here. It says the spade is a symbol of the water, but right here it says spade is a symbol of the air.
Yeah, that was the one that.
Oh well, look at that. Oops. So that probably could have used a better proofread.
Yeah.
Who proofread this book? Who is the editor? I'm gonna make fun of them real quick. I'm gonna dox them.
Let's not, because we don't know. Number one, that mistake, and there was one typo that I noticed, but otherwise. I haven't really picked up on anything else. Doesn't mean there aren't other mistakes.
I don't see an editor credited.
Oh, it's probably because they just had an in-house editor. They didn't credit them. Because I don't do that. Oh, no, they do credit the artists.
Yeah, they credit everybody else. There's no credited editor. Well, there you go. Next time, credit your editor.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that was his revenge. They're not going to give me a credit. I'll mess up their little spade example.
Oh, you think you're so smart about the cards, huh? Maybe he hated that system and he's just making fun of it.
It'd be very interesting to know what if there were any kind of like politics that made their ways into the books from that time.
Like petty office squabbles. Yeah. That's such a delightful idea.
We'll have to see if we can get James Louder on the program and see if he can give us the skinny.
It's no way a long shot. That'll definitely happen. Tune in next week, folks.
He wrote Night of the Black Rose, James Louder. And a lot of other things, but that's my favorite book from him was Night of the Black Rose.
Oh man. So this has been a pretty broad discussion, actually. I didn't think we were going to get this deep into like game history and like the current state of gaming and stuff like that, but like we really did. And I feel like we covered some good ground this time. Overall, I'm actually really intrigued to start digging into the further into this book because like I've really dug the principles they've laid down in these opening chapters. Like they've really done a great job, in my estimation, of like just distinguishing this from mainline D&D in a way that's really characterful and usable. Like that's really neat.
Well, our next two chapters are probably the most boring. I will warn you of that. they're necessary but boring. Like the spells in Ravenloft chapter is largely a list of how spells are altered. Do you know what I mean? So, it's not the most exciting read. But we have Lands of the Core to look forward to. Page 60 is where things will really kick up quite a bit.
So where are we reading to this next time? Because we have spells in Ravenloft, and then it's magic items is the one after that, and then it's Lands of the Core. Lands of the Core is pretty hefty.
I think we should do spells and magic items because Lands of the Core is gonna. That's a deep dive. That's a deep dive. You gotta be able to really sit down and read those. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like it needs my full attention. Do you want to do lands after this next one? Do you want to do lands and Islands of Terror or
no?
Because there's only 2 pages in Islands of Terror. Like it's really light.
It is lighter. We'll see. When you get through the Lands of the Core. We'll see how you feel about Islands of Terror.
Okay. I've been pretty ravenous with this. I stuck to once every 2 days for reading chapters, and then when I got to after the Gypsies chapter, I immediately read the next chapter. I felt like they kind of were companion chapters.
Yeah, they were.
I actually had to force myself not to keep reading into the spells and Ravenloft thing because I'm genuinely like I love the nuts and bolts of mechanics a lot. Maybe too much for my own good, but this is going to be a chapter that's a lot more rewarding to me probably than to you.
It's a chapter that I remember having to refer to all the time during play, but I remember it's not the exciting read that the reshaping of characters is, or
kind of like reading a cookbook. It's more about consulting it when necessary and less about reading it as prose. Yeah. So it's a different kind of read.
I do think the magic item chapter is probably going to be more interesting than the.
Well, magic items are nifty, especially in old D&D, because they all sort of have their own story. Yeah. Anyway, so those are my parting thoughts. What are your parting thoughts on these chapters?
I don't know. There's a lot of chapters we covered.
We did, but how did this strike you the first time you read it? Like, what was so intriguing about these opening chapters to you?
I don't know what it was, to be honest. I just know that I think, again, it was the overall style of the book. It was... I think things like just realizing that this was a setting where curses operated that way, things like that were really drawing me into it, and also the possibilities hinted at. Like when you read about like they give an example of a character who's cursed. I forget what it was by stormy skies or something. Immediately I'm like my brain is thinking, oh, it'd be really great to like curse a character so that they can't go out into the sun, and then maybe eventually they become a vampire over time. You know what I mean? Like things like that. I feel like it's these opening chapters are chapters you read and you get a lot of ideas of what you would like to do with this game, and so it's I don't know. It's a very sort of usable introduction. Do you know what I mean? It's well written. It's flavorful, but it's stuff where you read it and you're like, oh, I know exactly how I can use that in a game now. It's just kind of a and I think too what it was for me was Ravenloft was always kind of a mystery for me when it first came out, because like I remember, and again, I think I got into it probably about a year after the box set came out is my guess, 6 months or a year. Whenever Night of the Black Rose came out, that's when I got into Ravenloft, and I don't remember the precise chronology, but I read that book, and I was kind of, before that, I remember being a little bit dismissive of Ravenloft and being like, I don't know how I feel about this attempt at horror in D&D. But reading Night of the Black Rose is what convinced me that it was just like, wow, Soth is having such difficulty contending with Strahd, and the land has got these principles I don't understand. That's making this more scary to me. And so the process of reading this box set was the process of being taught what those principles were that were only hinted at in Night of the Black Rose. So that's I think what did it for me was the double whammy of reading Night of the Black Rose, becoming very intrigued about what the Demiplane of Dread was, and then getting to learn about what the Demiplane of Dread was in the in the black box set. And the black box set was so readable because I I had a bunch of settings and a bunch of box sets, but I hadn't really encountered one that just demanded to be read the way this one did. Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of them were sort of a chore to read, and this was one where I really
Yeah.
enjoyed reading it, and I don't know how, I don't know why, I just did.
Why? That's another thing that I think is remarkable about it, and I want to draw attention to that too, because like a lot of old sets are you bounce off of them as a
Yeah,
reader because like they're not readable. They're there to be consulted. You're supposed to already kind of know what you're doing,
yeah,
and so it's more about like prepare. It's used as a tool to help you prepare content for games. This is it's different. The character of the text is different. It's more about here are some concepts and philosophies and general techniques you can use with what you already know how to do. And it's teaching you this different kind of skill set, and it's bringing you subtly and skillfully into this dark gothic world. And it's doing it like every page has this beautiful black design to it. Like
yeah.
it's a brilliant use of like the color and the darkness and the tone of all the art, and it it flows so beautifully. It's constructed so beautifully with the text and the texture of it all. Like you can't help but get into a mood where you get excited to run something gothic with these same principles that you're learning about. It's fresh and it's inviting to a new reader. I could see especially this would play to someone who was younger and had never encountered them before.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's and I as if anyone's listening to this, they never actually encountered Ravenloft before. I got to tell you, the Realm of Terror is pretty remarkable in that regard. Even later Ravenloft stuff, which I've tried to read, I had that same kind of bounce off effect. But like this one, I'm enjoying it.
I,
Like
I
it's fun.
I think the later Ravenloft stuff, at least for me, was just too ornate and flowery. It had too much content and it had too many words, if that makes sense.
Well,
And
it went back to being more like a thing where I don't know, like there's this weird divide in a lot of modules where like there's prose and then there's the stuff you'll use in your game.
yeah,
And this one has this kind of middle ground where it's like here's techniques that you can use with these small additional rules we're putting in to really make this work with the game you already know. And
yeah,
there's not a hard divide between something being prosaic and something being mechanical. And the authors know that too. They have kind of a sense of humor that kind of permeates the whole thing and makes it go down a lot easier.
yeah.
So
I feel like this is very digestible. Is
yeah,
definitely
there you go.
yeah,
It's
it's
a good term for it.
digestible. It's very digestible. And a lot of setting books aren't. A lot of setting books are you're kind of stuck reading like the equivalent of a history book for a fictional setting. Um, and I like
Mm.
history, but like I don't necessarily want to read 10 pages of each individual area in the map. Do you know what I mean? Like that's where I think this style just kind of works better for me. Um,
Yeah, it's evocative without being like heavy, you know?
yeah,
A lot of books like that, a lot of setting books are heavy. Like you said, you're digesting geographic description and like political realities and like trade routes and stuff that like how am I going to make this something that happens in my game? This tells you what's important about it, and it says here's how you make those important things pop and make
yeah,
sense and matter to your players. I love that.
yeah. I think it really is like there's a simplicity to this book that um, just for me made it really easy to use. And I think usability to me is important. Um, but it doesn't lack for like style or flavor. So it's a nice it strikes a nice balance. It's some it's like they manage to be concise, but they still get you know
Oh yeah,
they
they
still
still
create
realize what they're doing.
they create atmosphere still. So I just like the way that it was done. But yeah, so we should probably end it here, and we'll be on next time, and we'll continue into the spell chapters, and then ultimately into the land of Ravenloft itself, which I think is where this will get to be very interesting. So until then, we will talk to you later.